Coogs House. Yesterday, we spent a lot of time talking about how the Houston Cougars are the best basketball team in the country, and a lot of people had a problem with it because technically they're ranked number 2. Well, I think that's about to solve itself.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, the daily podcast all about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach, Parker Ainsworth, here to break down all things Cougs. If you're a U of H fan or just a hater who came to stop by, please be sure to subscribe down below. That way, latest on the Cougs in your newsfeed each and every day. Appreciate you making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. If you found us on YouTube, welcome back. It is so good to see you again. Remember to hit subscribe. Doing a giveaway over 200 subscribers. We just hit over 2,000. Actually, might expand those. We'll see how the algorithm works. Anyway, hit subscribe. Let's get to the next big marker. Like and comment the video. Let us know you're in the contest you want to be in so badly. If after hearing a lot about basketball and the state of college basketball, the world of college basketball, you just don't know what to say, tell us what the best year of Madden was. Now, I'll do some talking about college basketball from a number of different angles. But yesterday we had a conversation that came up because after beating Iowa State, I referenced that Houston was the best team in America from a couple different angles. And I had a lot of pushback because UConn was actually number 1 in the AP and coaches polls. Well, I guess technically they will be again until Monday, but I think that's going to fix itself between now and then. I want to talk about UConn and Houston, how Houston is a better team, because I actually wrote some of this segment before they lost. More on that in a moment. The first segment. The second segment is, why does it matter to be a number 1 overall seed, or number 1 in the AP poll at this late juncture in the year? And then last but not least, while you think that UConn was all the chaos and craziness in college basketball, it most certainly was not. But it was chaotic enough to open up our segment and talk about how it impacts Houston, because number 1 UConn fell to Creighton 85-66. Creighton, I should point out, is number 15. Not a bad team by any stretch, but 85-66. For what it's worth, UConn had already beaten Creighton this year in Connecticut by 10 points. So this, 30-point turnaround nearly is kind of ridiculous. UConn was led by guard Tristan Newton. He had 27 points. He was about all they could get going on offense. Took 21 shots to get those 27 points, for what's worth as well. Creighton had a much more balanced scoring attack. Stephen Ashworth had 20. Trey Alexander had 16. Really balanced. Again, they had 4 starters in double figures. Solid game plan from Creighton going into this one. And so that's to say that on Monday, there will be a new number 1 team in America, presumably. And if Houston beats Baylor on Saturday, and we'll talk this week why I think they should do that as well. It's difficult, don't get me wrong. But if Houston were to beat Baylor on Saturday, they would theoretically take over that spot. And this conveniently helps make my argument for me. But I sat down here to talk to you for a second about how I think even if Connecticut were to have won this game against Creighton, Houston is the better team, and demonstrably so. So I wanted to look at the UConn resume, and admittedly, it builds upon a national championship a year ago, and that is impressive. I don't want to take that away from anyone. It is a different team. That team put guys in the pros. That team graduated players. It is a different team. This team has been the number 1 team in the AP poll since January 15th, so just over a month. And it feels almost like there was a complacency. They were just kind of getting pushed through as the number 1 team in the country. They haven't ever been lower than 6th. They lost 2 games in the span of a month in December, and 6 was as low as they fell in any of that mess. And then kind of as other teams in front of them lost since that loss on December 20th, they had just kind of moved up, and then had moved out of the way. Just kind of like almost feel like it's just the next domino to fall or whatever. Their losses before Tuesday night, they had lost to Kansas by 4 in Kansas on December 1st, and they'd lost at Seton Hall about 3 weeks later. Close wins that are like notably close. Like, why was that so close? They beat Xavier by just 5. They won at Villanova by 1. They won at Butler by 7, and they won over Providence by 9. Those are only single-digit wins on their resume. Some of those do raise an eyebrow, to say the least. But their big non-conference wins, I think, are what kind of made me ruffle my brow a little bit. They beat Indiana, who's notably not very good this year. They beat Texas, who's notably very, very up and down this year. They beat North Carolina, who had a rough start to the season. And they beat Gonzaga, who has also tried to adjust or lose some players to the transfer portal last spring and summer, all in the non-conference. Those are the only big marquee wins in non-conference. When people say that Houston has not played anyone, or those kinds of comparative and analytic kind of things people try to make up on the fly because of AP rankings as opposed to net rankings and those kinds of things, I would point out that, well, sure, Texas was AP ranked when UConn beat them, but they're not now, right? And so what does that really tell you about UConn? Like, sure, they beat the team that we thought on paper in November was going to be good, but the team has not turned out to be good in multiple cases across their marquee wins. Yes, they ultimately did lose to Creighton and Omaha by 19 points. And I don't mean to make Creighton out to be an easy place to play. However, it demonstrated a trend in ways that it seems like to me people in the games that they play well against or beat UConn beat them. UConn is big. They got Donovan Clingan, 7'2" with a positive wingspan, giant guy inside, right? His sub, Samson Johnson, is also 6'10" with positive wingspan. They constantly have one of those two guys on the floor, never both, one of those two guys on the floor, meaning they always have someone who plays well above the rim by just standing there. Okay. Their guards do an okay job with the basketball. They're not like guys that fill it up from behind the arc. They have 3 guys that can shoot well above average relative to all of college basketball. But as a team, they're frankly like a good March team, but not like blowing doors off, knocking everyone's socks off kind of shooting team by any stretch. I think what's interesting is that after whichever one of those two centers on the floor for them, they're really fairly comparable in height to a Houston team. And they go like 6'4", 6'6", 6'8", etc. across the rest of their guys. And once you factor in wingspans at the power forward spot, the 6'8", I mean, that's Jawan Robertson. He's covering the 6'8" guy. We're fine. 6'6" and Emmanuel Sharp, 6'4" and change, 6'5". That's fine. 6'4" versus Jamal Shead, we've seen him do that before, right? These are not crazy, gigantic athletes that did their guard spots for Houston to match up with. And in all 3 of their losses and multiple other games that they kept close, UConn has lost to teams that have a rim protector and a guard that can control the game. Javier Francis is that rim protector. Jamal Shead is that guard. We saw Kansas beat UConn with Hunter Dickinson and McCullers, right? Bediako and Kadari Richmond. When Seton Hall beat them was the same kind of combo. And then when Creighton just won last night, they had a couple different guards play very well, but Kofbrenner was the guy that kind of controlled the rim from a defensive standpoint. I think Francis and frankly I'd add Tugler and Roberts can do the same kinds of things from an energy perspective. I know that Francis is listed at 6'9" or whatever, but his wingspan and then obviously athleticism makes up for a lot of that. And then also, frankly, I think he does a great job athletically and coming over to slide from help side and doing what I call a two-step gallop. The two-step gallop is like when you're coming off your help guy, you have to like make the decision and you got 1, 2 and gallop up into the air to try and deter, block, etc. Javier does a great job of that. Kellen Sampson does a great job of coaching that in big individual drills, clearly, because the guys all know how to do what they're doing and time those things up. And then each of these games, and again, Creighton kind of had 2 guards really do it between Alexander and Ashworth. Each of these games have had the team that gives UConn a hard time. The point guard has controlled the game. What have we seen Jamal Shead do really in every game, save maybe one this year, right? Jamal will be that guy if these two teams were to ever match up. I'm very confident in that. And those are the reasons that I think that it's kind of silly that this was ever even a conversation, that UConn was ever even actually debated as ahead of Houston. That's not, here's where it's going to get clipped and taken away. It's not that UConn is bad. I don't mean to say they're bad. And if they played a 7-game series, I don't think Houston sweeps UConn or anything silly. I'm not dumb. I am saying that I feel like in watching the product on the floor, Houston would give UConn a lot of problems in ways that UConn would not give Houston. And Houston would actually have favorable matchups across the board. And Houston's played better teams. Now, I want to talk about why number one seed means anything in a second. I think it's worth pointing out that there are some pros and cons to that conversation that we do need to have. But we also need to have the conversation about tickets, because I don't know if you guys have looked, but Waco this weekend, for Houston going to Waco to play Baylor on Saturday morning, is not that far away. And for what it's worth, tickets can get really, really expensive. It's a number 11 Baylor team in a brand new stadium hosting the number 2, soon to be number 1 team in the country, potentially in Houston. A little bit of rivalry going on there. We call it the Ann Richards Bowl, Mac Rhodes, whatever you want to call the rivalry of sorts. And so if you're looking for tickets, long story short, you got to go to Game Time. The Game Time app is the place to be. Download the Game Time app today. Use code Locked On for $20 off. They show you what the view looks like. They show you all kinds of different value deals around the arena. If you give them a section and row and let them pick the seats, you get an average of 18% savings. And if you can find tickets in the same section and row somewhere else for cheaper, they'll refund you 110% of the difference. All kinds of great efforts from Game Time to make sure they're getting the best prices out there. So visit Game Time, download the Game Time app today. Use code Locked On, LOCKEDON, for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute to get the lowest prices guaranteed. All right, so I think a lot of people, somewhat accurately, have been like, Parker, what's the big deal? Once you're in the top 4, certainly the top 2 or 3, you pretty much have it, top 2 definitely, a guarantee you're going to get one of the 4 number 1 seeds in March Madness. And really within your region, theoretically, a number 1 seed is all that matters to get the Final Four. Final Four, you got to win 2 games in 3 days. We just won 2 very impressive games to win in 3 days. I think it's worth pointing that those kind of things can play in Houston's favor. And to many of those critics that say that's fair, since the tournament expanded to 64 teams in 1985 and was more or less the same bracket it is now at 68 teams. There have been 37 champions because they didn't play that one in 2020, right? And of those 37 champions, 24 have been number 1 seeds, so one of the 4 highest ranked teams in the tournament. I guess the truth is that if you can be a number 1 seed, that's fine. And truthfully, being the 1 or 2 seed in this instance, being ahead of Kansas, I should say, would be important. Now, Kansas is not in the top 4 right now, but if things were to shake out where they were, you want to make sure that you're ahead of them, because the way that the placement works for these things is you can pick the region you're playing in. They go the first number 1 overall seed gets to pick the second number 1 overall seed, or the number 2 seed, and the third number 1 overall seed, or the number 3, etc. Gets going down the list. And typically at that highest end of the bracket, you're picking games close to home. This year, there is a Sweet 16 Elite 8 weekend happening in Dallas, Texas, just about 4.5, 5 hours up the road, right? And so, while Dallas is Dallas, that is as close to a home game as you're going to get outside of the city of Houston for the Cougars, right? A lot of alumni in the DFW area. Not a bad trip if you want to play it on a Friday and Saturday, or a Thursday and Saturday. It's Good Friday weekend, so Good Friday actually probably be off of work. You can take it off of work if you're not, right? Not a bad weekend if they get that draw. Being a 1, 2, and maybe even 3 in the AP poll could kind of guarantee that. If you were to fall to 4, then you're like, okay, who ahead of me might want that South draw? Could an SEC team say, like, that's the most southern point, so we want to go through the South? Could Kansas say, like, we're not going to go all the way out to California, Nevada, go west. We're going to stay at Dallas because it's closer than those places are. Those kinds of things can get iffy and shaky. If Houston's above those teams, obviously that will help. But statistically, being the number one overall seed not only means that you get a better chance or better say in which place you're playing at along the way, but it also has proven to basically be a lock to make the Sweet 16. Again, there have been 37 tournaments since 1985. Okay. Only 6 times has the number one overall seed not made it to the Sweet 16. 2018, Virginia lost to Maryland, Baltimore County. That was the 16 seed right in the very first round. Nova lost to an 8 or 9, I forget, but Wisconsin in 2017. 2013, Gonzaga lost to a 9 seed, Wichita State. 2004, Stanford lost to an 8 seed, Alabama. 1994, North Carolina lost to a 9 seed, Boston College. In 1990, Oklahoma lost to an 8 seed, North Carolina. You'll notice each of those, outside of Virginia, because it's Virginia, lost to an 8 or a 9 seed. I'm not going to act like those aren't potentially difficult. We saw Houston have moments last year was a 1 seed in the region they were in. They struggled some with Auburn, right? Took a Tremont Mark performance to kind of make sure that they didn't get upset in that one. However, those are incredible odds to make it to the Sweet 16. And as the number one overall seed, you've picked where you're playing those Sweet 16 and Elite 8 games as a program if you keep winning, right? And so I think all that is to say, especially with one of those 4 regionals being in the state of Texas this year, the odds of making to a Sweet 16 could potentially have a home court feel. Those are really, really high all of the sudden. Now, I would point out that the number one overall seed, the number one AP poll, or whatever you want to call it, the top team in the rankings going in, the team that will always wear the home jersey, has won the entire thing 4 times and been to a total of 10 national championship games in those 37 tournaments. That means you have like better than 25% odds that you make the national championship game if you're the number one overall seed, right? I understand that there are extraneous things there, and I understand that, frankly, we'd all want it to be higher. But relatively speaking, statistically speaking, looking at the randomness of this tournament, that's as good odds as you're going to get at any spots, right? And of course it is. It's the top team in the tournament. Some of that is, of course, impacted by those are also very good basketball teams, right? I don't mean to like overlook that part of it, but Houston is a very good basketball team, very well coached, super tough, etc. And I think that those things play in their favor. If you were to tell me that if, playing a strong finish the regular season and conference tournament gave you a 1 in 4 chance to play in the NCAA tournament championship game, I think we'd all take that. That's the importance of what's happening down the stretch here, is sealing up that number one spot does give you those kinds of odds, because frankly, then statistically speaking, you're going to get the weakest of the 8-9 matchups. You're going to get the weakest of the 2 seeds theoretically. You get the weakest of the so on and so forth, right? And so then, while you're kind of relying on certain things get picked in certain ways, and upsets happen every year, and what you're giving yourself is the best chance. I understand we'll take whatever cards were dealt, and I trust Kelvin to play with whatever cards are dealt his way. I do think, though, that we saw last year Marcus Sasser and his groin injury, Jamal Shedd's knees wore down. Frankly, Jawan Roberts' knee over the course of this season. If you can make that path easier, where you're not necessarily resting guys, but you're having easier games at the front end of the tournament after a brutal gauntlet of a Big 12 schedule, you might be preserving your body in minutes for the long run. Those things will be important this year. And frankly, the unsung part about a bunch of blowout wins in the season thus far, including Texas last Saturday, has been that you can rest Jamal, you can rest Jawan, you can rest Francis, you can rest Cryer in those moments, and you're up 25. Your second team's good. Things are okay. Now, a lot has to happen. I'm potentially getting ahead of myself, but it felt pertinent this week to talk about the AP number one overall and the number one overall seed in March Madness tournament. However, I don't want to look too far down the road because right now the Big 12 is an absolute chaos. And chaos can be really fun. As a coach, I preach we want to have controlled chaos in the court at all times. But one place you probably don't want chaos is like games you're picking. And if you want to be in control of the picking, you got to go to FanDuel.com because as the Super Bowl just happened and people are transitioning into paying a lot more attention to basketball, you've been doing that here at Locked On Hoops for a long time, but I hear you. You can get buckets with your first bet at FanDuel America's #1 Sports because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets by winning any $5 bet. Now they still have the Houston Rockets as 7-point dog on Thursday night in New Orleans. I think New Orleans is good, but I don't know if they're that much better than Houston. I think Houston's going to lose in a more heart-crushing way, frankly. So I'm telling you that's at FanDuel because right now they got all kinds of quick bets, same game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/locked on and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. All right, so I mentioned that there was absolute chaos in the Big 12, and as of the recording of this podcast, Houston is still all alone atop the conference officially. Okay, but right behind them is that pesky Iowa State team at 9-4. Kansas and Baylor and Texas Tech are all tied, but in that order and tiebreaker because of Kansas and then Baylor and then Tech at 8-5. BYU is at 7-6, and all of those 6 teams are ranked presently. All of those 6 teams are ranked presently. TCU is also 7-6, but not ranked. Texas is 6-7. Oklahoma 6-7. Cincinnati and Kansas State are not necessarily out of the big picture. Can we make March Madness stretch by any measure at 5-7 and 5-8 respectively? That is to say that, and we'll get to the games in a moment, but Houston needs to kind of keep stacking up wins here to, frankly, kind of continue to propel themselves and kind of give themselves some breathing room between Iowa State and Kansas, especially with Kansas having currently the tiebreaker. They will play each other again at the end of the season. Houston heads to Baylor this Saturday. Early morning tip-off, like 11 a.m. Central Time. Then they have Cincinnati game on Tuesday, early game Tuesday. Then they have Oklahoma the following Saturday, Central Florida the following week. Both of those are road games. The road part of that I think is particularly important, especially in the Oklahoma game. There'll be undoubtedly something for Sampson and Hollis and Quantas and so on, right? And then ultimately, you wrap the season, the regular season, by hosting Kansas, currently in the top 10, and on your heels for the conference. All that is to say that Houston needs to continue to work to build some room between them and the 2-3 seeds. And with the win against Baylor this weekend, they really could, right? Now, on Monday and Tuesday night, there was some absolute chaos. Texas Tech edged out TCU and Lubbock to stay at that 8-5 tie. Pop Isaac had 19 points. 3 other starters for Tech had 14 apiece. Pretty impressive outlook from scoring output from Tech at home. Will be interesting to see if that loss they gave TCU to give them their 6th loss in conference play ultimately does anything towards keeping them out of the tournament or not. Anyway, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I think that TCU team's really darn good, but Tech's hard to beat at home. BYU might have had the win of the night in beating Baylor in Provo. They shot 39% from 3 at home. We remember playing BYU, how well they shoot the basketball. Ali Khalifa was 4 of 6 from 3. Jackson Robinson was 3 of 8. BYU had 4 guys in double digits. Baylor had just 8 guys in assists. So one thing I'm keeping an eye on as I get ready to prepare and talk about the game this weekend, how well is Baylor moving the basketball? Is that 8 assist number from the BYU game indicative of BYU's defense? I thought BYU was really impressive. Or is it something to do with Baylor? Is Baylor relying and falling into too much ISO stuff? The last thing I'll say about that matchup is Baylor, I think, was favored on FanDuel and sportsbooks and things like that. Had Baylor won that game, they'd also be at 9-4, and that would have made the game against Houston on Saturday that game for the number one overall seed, right? Because a win would have made them and Houston both 10-4, and then they'd have the ultimate tiebreaker, and we only get to play them once this season. So I don't know if that's BYU beating Baylor. I don't know if that's good for Houston, that it kind of creates some breathing room, takes a little bit of the stress off of what this game could have meant, or it's the truth that every Big 12 game is stressful, and all you've done is kind of made Baylor hungrier to come home. I don't know what the answer is. I do know that the game was nuts, absolutely nuts. West Virginia got back in the win column, beat Central Florida on Tuesday night. Raekwon Battle had 24 points on 15 shots. Central Florida's Darius Johnson had 29 points on 23 shots. Some parts of that one, if you go back and watch parts of it, just feel like one-on-one. Those guys are just bucket getter type of guys. And the excitement of beating Iowa State on Monday night, I did not point out that Texas got back on track in their own way with a win over Kansas State. There was an ejection of Kansas State player in that one. Took out the Weaver guy in the air. It was really kind of dirty play. And for what it's worth, Jerome Tang seemed very much like, yeah, he's got to sit for. He understood the safety measures of the game. I like Tang a lot. It was good to see him. Good to see him act that way. He's like, I understand my guy made a mistake. I'm gonna send some guys back there to go talk to him a little bit, like almost like counsel. But I get what happened. Like, he was very, very like level-headed of the situation, a way that coaches maybe aren't always. Dylan Dessou kind of led the way for Texas, had 20 points. Texas continues to shoot the ball poorly. They have way too many high-end, high-star caliber guys to shoot the ball that poorly, but they are, but managed to win anyway. The big game in the Big 12 on Wednesday night, and the only game in the Big 12 on Wednesday night, is Cincinnati, Oklahoma State. Now, I will say that with Cincinnati being the team Houston plays after Baylor, I'll probably watch that one just to kind of get some eyes on what Cincinnati looks like now. I mean, we've seen Cincinnati once before, but what do they look like at this point in the season? And as we play them on Tuesday of next week, kind of like what do they look like a week out from that game? This weekend on Saturday, everyone in the Big 12 is active. But the game of the weekend is Houston-Baylor at 11 a.m. Central Time. It's a fun one. It'll be an exciting one. And again, it feels like each of these games is a dogfight, a street fight, a must-win basketball game as we get through the chaos of the Big 12. Now, I am enjoying talking a lot about basketball. We're going to try and get a little bit of football sprinkled in this week as well, but we have Baylor folks to talk to, Baylor game to break down, etc. All kinds of things. I'm trying to get to Wake. We'll see if that happens or not. All kinds of fun things going on with Locked On Cougs. Make sure you subscribe, like, and comment the videos. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you didn't. Tell me if you think I need to shave or something. I don't know. Tell me whatever you want to in the comments down below. I can take it. I promise. Locked On Cougs. It's a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network. It is your team, our best team in America. Cougs every day. Go Cougs.